All right. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural ecology seminar of our academic year. I'll try to hold this cube and my paper. So my name is Mariah Robinson. I'm in the biology department, and I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Eric Wood. Before I give him a little bit more of an introduction, just a reminder that there's still time to submit questions for the Q&A tomorrow, so please look for an email from Thad. And by the end of this talk and any conversations you have with Eric after this at the reception, I'm sure that will generate some questions too, so please do think about submitting those. So Dr. Wood received his bachelor's degree from Cal Poly and his master's degree from Humboldt State. He then went a little further east to Madison, Wisconsin to earn his PhD at the University of Wisconsin in forest and wildlife ecology. Dr. Wood is currently an associate professor at Cal State University, Los Angeles, and he's also the co-director of the Urban Ecology Institute at Cal State. As an educator, he also teaches some really neat courses. He teaches ornithology and also an awesome course that I would love to audit on the diversity of California ecosystems. So also a really great educator and mentor. So as many of you likely know, this seminar series is selected by our graduate students. So this invitation of Dr. Wood really represents the broad appeal of his work to the next generation of scientists and conservationists in this room. And considering Dr. Wood's research program and current leadership roles, it's easy to see why. So Dr. Wood's work is broadly focused on ecological processes in human-modified landscapes, particularly in urban ecosystems. And many of his projects focus on the changing ecology of birds in particular in these human-modified environments. But scanning through his CV, I kept getting distracted by a really large variety of topics that he has published on and been a part of. So this includes projects on the impacts of invasive species removal on desert riparian ecosystems, the outcomes of endangered butterfly management on non-target bird species, and testing a really broad array of remote sensing and imaging methods to understand ecological processes at large spatial scales, and also the role of historical and contemporary socioeconomic processes in shaping ecology of cities, which I think we'll be talking about some today. So he has also been successful in communicating the importance and impact of his lab's work, evidenced by recent receipt of several multi-million-dollar grants from federal agencies and international collaborations, which will, I'm sure, capacitate even more awesome research and mentorship. So I'm super excited for this talk. Eric's super wonderful to chat with. So do chat with him afterwards, and welcome. Please join me in welcoming him. Yeah.
All right. Am I turned on? Is the mic turned on? Thanks, Mariah. Thank you, everybody, for being out here. I've only been to Logan once. It was in a driving thunderstorm. I drove through from Wyoming, came down, was super excited to visit the town, and then it was just too rainy, so I couldn't do it. And I always thought, what an amazing place, though, driving through the mountains. Am I ever going to get back here? And so I'm so grateful to be back here. And I'm grateful for the process for you all for nominating me to come out. It's really an honor to be here. I see some familiar faces. I've been able to chat with people with lots of connections. If I haven't chatted with you yet, I look forward to doing that. And today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer you to a galaxy far, far, very far away from Logan, Utah. And that is the grit of Los Angeles, which is a city I love, and I've been living in 10 years, but a city that has a very different feel from here. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about today with urban ecology, all of us can wrap our minds around, whether you grew up in a city, whether you grew up in places like Logan, Utah. I'm from small towns. And so LA is really the first big city that I've grown up with. And again, all of us can wrap our minds around some of the stuff, hopefully, that I'm going to be talking about today. So there's no surprise to any of us in this room that cities have tremendous effects on biodiversity, both positive and both negative. And put your bird caps on and imagine you are a birder, if you are or not. All of us can look at a scene like we see right here of downtown Los Angeles and just imagine places where birds may thrive and places where they may struggle. And one thing that I am often guilty of, and I imagine some of us in the conservation world as applied ecologists are, is sometimes we can be real bummers at parties. And I'm thinking about that first paragraph of a lot of our papers, which often talks about the state of things, and often it's shed in a kind of a negative light. I share my papers with my parents. They don't read all of them, but often my mom asks me this question when we're thinking about urbanization and its effects on biodiversity. Is it all that bad? And on some of my best or worst Charlie Brown days, I feel like this. But then of course, there's endless inspiration also when we're thinking about our cities. Over the past 2 decades, and the field of urban ecology has been around for a lot longer, but really over the past 2 decades with LTER projects in Baltimore, in Phoenix, now in Minneapolis, there's loads and gobs of research going on in places like LA, New York, Chicago. It's really a super exciting branch of ecology, and it's impossible to keep up with all the literature that's coming out. So that answer is no, Charlie Brown. We don't have to always feel that it's that bad. And what I want to do today with this presentation is I'm actually going to talk about 3 things. I know a lot of you have read that redlining paper. That's going to be in the middle. But first, we're going to talk about a big project that I'm on, thinking about the historic ecology of LA. And I'm going to recreate the historical avifauna of Los Angeles and talk about how it's changed over time. That's going to feed into this idea about contemporary with this yellow-headed blackbird here. That's going to get into the redlining research that I believe some of you have read. And then we're going to get into where the hooded oriole is over on the right, thinking about the future of our cities, some things we're doing, the direction Los Angeles, and not just LA, but other places are going with what we need to do to be developing places that are good for both biodiversity and people. So I want to focus, I didn't mention this, tricolored blackbird. We'll talk about why I have this bird up here right now. So I just want to give you, and I hope you can see these slides okay in the back. So I just want to give you an overview about the rapid ascent of Los Angeles. This is downtown LA in the 1890s. Not much of a city then. A really important feature for you guys to look at is the water body, the river, moving from left to right. That's, of course, the famous LA River that you might have seen in movies like The Terminator or Grease as a concrete channel of water. And I can talk about what that's all about a little bit later. You can see the early formation of the grid, the agriculture, and this is really the start of the city. The action in California from the 1850s on was in San Francisco. There was no natural port in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles really didn't get its start until around this time, and it was really the discovery of oil. LA is very much an oil town, and that's really what was going on for 20, 30, 40 years, and you still see that throughout the city. Fast forward a little bit into the early 1900s, there was a development of the port down in San Pedro, the Long Beach area. Eventually, water was diverted in 1913 from the Eastern Sierra Nevada, and then all of a sudden you have this, which we think of when we think of modern day LA. Of course, LA is an iconic global city. We all know about it, whether it's through entertainment or whatnot. And for me, LA is a fascinating city to live in. It's fascinating for a number of reasons. One, it really is kind of a mess in some ways, but it's also a place that has endless amounts of thought, inspiration, creativity that I haven't seen anywhere I've ever lived. And to couple that together with research in terms of how to design and develop and reimagine a place like this, it's a super exciting place to be. But one thing that I do as not someone who's from Los Angeles, I'm from up in the San Francisco Bay Area, is I drive around this place and I often just think, what did it used to look like? Southern California is a naturally amazing place in terms of its ecosystems, but it's paved over. And so I think, what was here? What did it used to look like? And a bunch of my colleagues used to think about that too. And that brings me to the first research question that I'm going to talk about today. And that's this idea about understanding the past distributions of birds throughout greater LA to see what we have lost and what remains. Now, when we're thinking about recreating a historical avifauna community, some of you might be thinking of eDNA or some other approaches about this. I'm going to talk about museum specimens and what we can really do with that. I'm going to talk about why LA is a really interesting place for this. And maybe there's places in Utah where you could do something real similar. So where to start with this? First, we need to know what it looked like. Here's a historical land cover of Los Angeles. And for those of you that are not familiar with this landscape, Long Beach down here, Redondo Beach going up into Santa Monica, the names are behind. Downtown LA is somewhere in the middle. This is a huge area that we're looking at right here. And one thing that I want to impress upon you with this area is Los Angeles and coastal Southern California is topographically diverse. Because of that topography, Because of the mountains, you get these orographic effects and rain shadows all over the place and microclimates that lead to a diversity of ecosystems that you could see here. So the first thing I want you to do when you look at this is say, it doesn't matter where the grasslands are, the riparian, the woodland, but there's a diverse number of ecosystems that were in that area. Then when you have a land cover like this, the historic land cover, we can overlay it on top of that historic bird, egg, and nest records. One of the most amazing museums, I promise you, if you have the chance to do this, is in Camarillo, California, which is between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. It's called the Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology. It hosts one of the largest egg collections in the world, and it's like Indiana Jones. It's a warehouse. You walk in, there's boxes everywhere, eggs all over the place, and they've hand digitized where eggs were collected throughout Los Angeles in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Remember, there wasn't much of a city at this point. And then think about this timeline. This is not too far away from Darwin and Wallace, and when collections were really a big deal throughout the world. So people were collecting like crazy. Joseph Grinnell and other famous people who have done this stuff were from Los Angeles. And so you had this situation where people, again, were collecting before that city was developed. And there's very few places we can do that in this country. Can't do that in New York, can't do that in Chicago, can't do that in some of the other mega cities around. There are some good data there, but really LA has it. So of course, once you have these two, you can merge these two data sets together. I'm not going to go over the analyses. We went through a full occupancy analysis where we recreated and fit models based on the land cover types, the bird eggs for about 110 bird species throughout the area. And I'll show you what this looks like. All right, how many bird nerds do we have here? Yes. Okay, you guys are going to be on quiz for this. And just pretend like you know Southern California. Maybe you do, maybe you don't for this one. The first bird, an amazing bird, a loggerhead shrike that's going to be positively associated with the proportion of grassland and coastal sage scrub, which is an amazing ecosystem, shrubby ecosystem in the coastal bluffs in Southern California. This bird would be positively associated with this. You fit the model and you can fit the predictions across the landscape. I'll talk about these grids in a second. And this was the historical distribution of this bird. We have to have a modern comparison that we want to compare this with. So each one of these grids that you guys see here in the gray is a 6 kilometer squared grid that was used for the Breeding Bird Atlas project. And so this is a population level project. It was done in the late 90s in LA, so it's not exactly current, but it didn't matter for this question because we just were asking this question about when you develop this city, and we needed confirmed breeding. What the people who were doing the BBA would do, they'd go out, they would look for birds, and they would say, yes, there's a nest there. Yes, there's some kind of confirmation that that bird's breeding there, and that can mean we can merge it with our historic egg and nest records and get an image of how this bird has changed over time, up or down in terms of its population across the landscape. Come on, bird nerds. Down, of course. Okay, so when we see a bird that's going to be affiliated with these different types of ecosystems, the loggerhead shrike is right there saying it's not going to work for me in this modern day landscape. So about a 60% decrease in those cells that were occupied by this bird. You might ask the question, why? Okay, so let's look at the San Fernando Valley. This is a very famous place. This is the valley that you've known and heard about in different movies. And this is what it looks like. This is perfect loggerhead shrike habitat, if you could imagine where that bird would be. This is up here. This is what it looks like now. It's your suburban dream. You irrigate water from the Colorado River, from Northern California, from the Eastern Sierra Nevada. You put it here, you can have lawns, you can have trees everywhere. And what's this place famous for? This, Spicoli and Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but you're getting this idea that it's suburban development everywhere. Birds that need that open type of ecosystem, they're not going to be able to be there. I'm going to go through two more examples and tie this all together for you guys. Next bird, one of my favorites, yellow-billed cuckoo. Those of us that know this bird in the West know this bird is not doing very well. They're positively associated with the amount of riparian forest and wash in the area. And you would see these birds along the courses of 3 major rivers in LA, the Los Angeles River, the Arroyo in the middle, and then the San Gabriel River. This bird, of course, I don't even have to do whether this is up and down. It's totally extirpated from LA. But you want to know the most interesting thing? This is a ray of hope about this one. This summer, a good friend of mine who runs the Moore Lab of Vertebrate Zoology at Occidental College, John McCormick, had a yellow-billed cuckoo smash into his window at his campus. Out of all the windows in Los Angeles that this bird can smash into, it did it in John McCormick's building where his lab is. And this was during the summer, during the breeding period. So this bird was around in LA. So I don't know if it bred or not. There wasn't really evidence of a brood patch or any of that stuff that we look for, but it's pretty cool that something like this could be in that area. So maybe this could be something that could be good. Okay, so why would this bird, what did it associate with? It used to be with this gallery forest that used to be along all the rivers in LA. And of course, what we've had to do, meaning we had to do, This is what it looks like on the rivers. In LA, it's covered with mountains all around it. In the wintertime, when we get our rains, and all that water just goes right down to the valleys and would flood. And there were some catastrophic floods in the early 1920s. The Army Corps of Engineers said, get in here, let's channelize these rivers, let's get the water out to the ocean as fast as we can. And then we'll come up with this genius idea where we'll pump water from all over the West into LA to go ahead and use to develop the city. They can't undo this. They've been trying to undo this, and they can't undo this because of the flood risk. And so it's something everybody knows about. So there's other things that people are doing about how to try to capture some of that water, recharge the aquifers, whatever it is that they need to do. Okay, last one, then I'm going to tie this all together. An Anna's hummingbird. This is a very common bird of LA, but it used to not be historically common. You had to go to where the foothill woodlands, primarily coast live oak, which is a preferred tree for these birds for nesting, but also for foraging. And that would be in the foothills of the Santa Monica Mountains and getting up into the San Gabriel Mountains. This bird has taken off all over LA. And I'm gonna tie this together about why this is important. So you might ask this question about why. This is Burbank Avenue. There's probably studios all over this place or around that location. This is where a lot of the entertainment industry is. This is a terrible type of habitat for an Anna's hummingbird. But then when you get all that water and do all that stuff that I was just talking about, and you plant coast live oaks all up and down the street, you put ornamental plants everywhere, of course that's going to benefit a bird like an Anna's hummingbird. So going back to that scene, we could all imagine places where a bird might thrive, where a bird might not thrive in this area. And of course, it's all due to our manipulation of the environment. Let's see if you can actually see this figure, because I want to look at what you're looking at. This is all 110 birds on the y-axis. The x-axis is just the relative change from the historical to the contemporary times for all these birds. Ignore the error bars for a second and just look at the blue dots and then focus on that red line. Everything to the left are birds that are proportionally declined big time. Everything on the right are things that have increased. Any guesses on what the increases are based on what I was just showing you? And I'm going to highlight this, and so it'll make it hopefully clear. Birds that need what kind of, sorry? Starlings, your synanthropic species for sure, and birds that need trees for sure. And so the winners in this whole thing are synanthropic species. Those are the species that are affiliated with people: starlings, pigeons, mockingbirds, house finches, and then some woodland birds, but not all, only some. But like an Anna's hummingbird has just taken off in a place like that. What about down here in terms of the quote losers? I hate using this terminology, but just for this talk here. So partners in flight species of concern, way down. Grassland birds, way down. Riparian birds, no, but I'm going to come back to a ray of hope about riparian birds later. And then wetland birds, all of those have nearly been pushed off. And so we've created this condition and created this city that is benefiting some species, but it's definitely coming at the detriment of others. So let's talk about that for a little bit. And then I just want to end this before moving on to the next section with kind of my thought about where we're going with all this. LA was not a treed landscape throughout much of it. I didn't walk through what all those ecosystems were, but it looks something like this. This is the San Gabriel Valley, Pasadena, that's the area where I live. And you could see the orchards, but a lot of open space down in here when you're looking in the valley. Of course, this is what it looks like now. You know what I thought when I was driving up in Salt Lake City? This doesn't look that different, does it? In terms of the mountains and driving along the Wasatch. So these are the San Gabriel Mountains there. But anyway, you can see the trees everywhere, the urban forest, all that stuff. And again, that's just planted. It's fake. It's Disneyland. All of it's fake that we were doing all over the place. So the city's freaked out about climate mitigation and urban heat. They're worried about things about what's going to be the future climate in 15 years and how can we have a resilient city that's going to last for this. There's a lot of pushes to keep planting trees, but a lot of places they don't make it. So maybe there's something we got to rethink in terms of what we're doing here. I love trees and I want to have those on the landscape as well, but there's a lot of thought going into, let's do some other things. We were a naturally shrubbery community with grasses, and that's what people are starting to do and starting to think about in other areas where it makes sense to do that. This is along where a train line comes, or a little park, but you see this more and more in a place like LA. It's pretty cool to see where the city's going. All right, I'm going to come back to where this is going to go on steroids when it hooks up with the Olympics, which are going to be there in 4 years, because there's a big strategy about go green, and a lot of it has to do this. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities, which is going to be pretty cool. Okay, so moving on to the contemporary phase, we just learned that there's been tons of changes in terms of what the bird community's done. That's the same in every city that we can imagine anywhere in the world. But then the question is, it's cool to start putting a number on it, but then the question is, what could potentially be some of the drivers that could be enhancing or limiting a bird community in a city? And so the question here is looking at exploring how historical investment practices have shaped our contemporary avifauna. This is my university right here. It's a cool location up in the hills, kind of close to downtown LA. All right, so I just want to start this with saying, when I first moved to LA, I would just do this drive where, does anyone know about the Huntington Library? Have you heard about this? Very famous and awesome place. And it's in like a super opulent part of LA. San Marino, which is where this picture is. And there's big trees everywhere. And it's awesome if you want a bird with your window down and just hear cool stuff, because there's birds everywhere in all the trees. So I mapped this route that would be the birdiest route that I could take to get to LA. I drive through all these really kind of ritzy areas on the way from Pasadena down to East LA. And it would look like this. And then I would cross the street and all of a sudden I'd be in East LA, and it looked very, very different to me. Now, keep in mind, I grew up in small towns. I grew up in college towns like Logan. I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know that you just cross the street and stuff would change. Yes, I've been in New York City and Chicago. I've been to all these places, but I haven't really lived it and thought about it and experienced it. So some of the very first projects in my lab, we were focused on this. We wanted to understand that variability within city so we could start understanding how our organisms, birds, insects, et cetera, were using the city. And this was a way to do it. This is called the luxury effect, which you may have heard of, whether you read the paper of mine or some other papers. And I say this is a tale as old as Los Angeles. This idea about the luxury effect is that there's a positive correlation with wealth and biodiversity. And I'm just going to illustrate this with trees that you can see here going from low to medium to high income. And then when we go out and just start measuring street tree cover, which these data are right here, you start seeing it. But as a newbie to a place like LA, I would ask my students who are all from there, and I'd say, what on earth is behind this? I have no idea what's behind this. I'm not from here. And that's really where this question came for us that I'm going to get into next. And really, the question that we're going to focus on are some of these historic investment practices. In 2015, when I started and we were studying these luxury effect things, I didn't even know what redlining was. I didn't know about any of this stuff because I never took a class to learn about it. I didn't live in an area to learn what it was. And it wasn't until 2020 when a very famous project called the Mapping Inequality Project came out, where I started learning about this. And I started having conversations with my friend, Chris Schell, who came here about this. And Chris is from Pasadena, where I was living. And I would say, Chris, what is up behind this? And he's like, you need to learn about this stuff. You know, you need to kind of read about what this is, because that's probably what's happening here. So we did read about this. And what was redlining? Well, redlining was, and this goes all the way back to the Great Depression and coming out of the Great Depression, the mortgage lending situation in the country was in total crisis. And this was a problem for our leaders because owning a house was the American dream. That was this idea about capitalism. And that was really the thing that our country was supposed to be founded on. So there's this big problem in terms of how lending was going. So during the New Deal, there was a program called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This was at the federal level to go and draw these security risk maps. So this is Los Angeles. And they were meant to draw it in 4 colors: red, yellow, blue, and green. In blue and green, these were communities that were already on the up: Beverly Hills, Bel Air, San Marino, very famous places you all know. Every famous rich place you go in LA was drawn in green. And that's where the investment was starting to come from. And the money poured into these locations. You can improve your house, you could build more to your house, whatever it was. And the yellow and the red, these were places where investment was either to be limited in the yellow, or it was downright hazardous, which is the red, and that's the notion for redlining. The thing with this was the 30s when this was going on, is that when you go to the Mapping Inequality Project and you click on any one of these areas, it actually tells you the language that the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, used to determine whether it was red line, yellow line, and it was often very racially biased, vulgar language, some other kind of classist thing about it. And that's where the state of our country was. This happened in over 250 cities in our country. Salt Lake City, this happened down there. And so this was going on. And so what blew my mind about this was we know the race history of this country, but our cities were also developed on this as well. And we wanted to understand, what more could this do for habitat and birds? That was something we were really interested in, because you can just see it when you're driving around. Okay, long introduction to that. Let's focus on another paper that came out in 2021, which was influential for our thinking. This is from Dexter, Locke, and crew. This is just looking at tree canopy cover in A and B, high investment, C and D, low investment neighborhoods. And this was just across the country. And you can see the clear pattern there. Of course, in those green lined and red lined areas, the big difference you notice in the tree canopy cover. And so as bird biologists, we're like, well, of course, that's going to influence birds who are tied to trees. So we want to look at that. Nobody's really looked at that yet. And of course, we want to know about other urban habitat features other than just the tree canopy cover, which turned out to not be that interesting, but we'll come back to that. So what do we do? These black dots are locations all throughout Los Angeles where my lab just every single winter goes and surveys birds. We focus on the wintertime because there's millions of birds that come to migrate to coastal Southern California. They just hang out, they eat, they do their thing, and they're going to look for the places where they're going to find their food. And that's really important in terms of where you're going to find them in the city. We overlaid our survey design, and we do this every single winter since 2015, on top of these maps. And I just started doing some basic analysis, and I was like, whoa, you just saw it right there in terms of the differences where those birds are going to be. Again, intuitive, obvious. You just drive around the city, but starting to put numbers to it and starting to peel apart the layers was what was fascinating. So we had 12 locations that were in these high investment locations, A and B, 13 in the low investment, C and D, and then 14 that were in these not graded areas. And that was really important for us because I wanted to get to this idea about what was the actual effect of the redlining and how can we measure that versus places that were not part of the program at all. So just diving straight into the results of this. What do the habitat conditions look like for this? So habitat, I'm just going to talk about some other features that we were measuring. So if you just look at the appraised land value, it's not the housing price. The housing price in LA is way higher than what you're seeing right here. But you're looking at the high investment areas now, still way higher value land than those redlined areas, the C and D locations. And then the not graded areas are performing very similarly. We tried as hard as we could to find high income areas that were, quote, not graded, but you can't find those in LA because all the high income areas, again, were in the A and B category. You still see that to this day. All right, so for square footage, much bigger lot sizes in those green line locations, the red line locations, tight houses pushed together, very little green space. That's what you see in South and East LA, moving all the way down towards to Long Beach. Tree canopy cover, the same thing as what Dexter Locke and those people were finding. That's not surprising. That's one of those things that you can just see. The impervious cover is going to be the reverse of that. And that's what you all almost always see when you're doing these urban ecology studies. Okay, so the obvious thing, what about the birds? So birds that like trees, forest birds, the aggregated abundance of about 20 species of birds like this yellow-rumped warbler, of course, they're going to be more common in those locations where they're going to be able to find their habitat. When you look at the reverse, those synanthropic species that we were talking about a little bit earlier, of course, they're going to be more common in the urban core. That for them is good. They love that kind of stuff. And so for them, they're like, yeah, high quality habitat. But at least for some of these birds that were worried about their populations declining, you're only going to find those in sections of LA where it's going to be high investment. So what are the potential drivers of this? We fit 20-something variables together in all this. And the real depressing thing about this was the thing that always kept popping out in the model was just land value. It kept popping out as the top thing here, which is not something you can really manage for. We don't want to it's not just tossing money at something. This goes back to all the things that are correlated with this. The amount of lot size, the amount of green area in a location, the amount of tree canopy cover you get somewhere. But look at how much of this model is explained by this right there, about 70% variation in that's pretty high. And then this is tree canopy cover, which we thought was going to be the winner. We thought, but much less, but still had a high predictive power. So what you can do with this stuff and where we really wanted to go, and the question that I was most interested in and my students were most interested in was this idea that they grew up in LA. They grew up in these communities. They wanted to know, can we experience different birds in these locations? And of course, they already knew that, but we wanted to start modeling that. So how do we do that across a city as big as LA? Well, you take our tree canopy cover maps. This is for all of Los Angeles. Remember, this is low, like low tree canopy cover at the different parcels, the red. LA is not a treed city, but they keep trying to plant trees, and they keep trying to plant trees in places where it doesn't work. The trees die, but that's one of the things they keep trying to do. The trees are confined to the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, the Santa Monica Mountains, and other places that were kind of hilly that already naturally could support more woodland ecosystems. When you look at land value, it's totally the beach, and then getting out into the montane areas. When you fit some models where you put these two together over these big spatial layers, and then you create a prediction about where you're going to see these certain birds, because those were the two top predicted variables, this is the story. We go out and validate this stuff, and this is true. This is what we find when we validate our models about where you're going to find the birds. This is coastal. Trees didn't grow here, but people plant them like crazy, and there's a lot of irrigation going on. So you still get these kind of forested conditions in some of these beach towns. And then for the urban birds, it's right in the urban core. So if we were to overlay this with census data and we were to ask this question, will residents across LA have similar experiences of birds in nature? You can start thinking about some things. And I want to walk you through some race and ethnicity maps because it's interesting to look at this. And this is something that really surprised me about LA. When I first moved to LA, I thought, I can't wait to live in this global city that's going to be mega diverse everywhere I go. And when you look at the gamma diversity of the city, it is mega diverse. But when you get into certain neighborhoods, it's hyper segregated in certain parts of LA. And you also see this in certain types of cities. And this really surprised me about moving to Los Angeles. You could be at the mall, you could be hanging out somewhere and you see that diversity. But when you go to places where people are living, you see that segregation. The African-American population in LA primarily lives from this location in Inglewood. Think of the SoFi Dome, all those kind of things if you're into football and all that, grading down into Long Beach. And you might say, what could be behind a pattern like this? Remember I mentioned this thing about LA being an oil town. Julie, this will be kind of an interesting image for you because this is Signal Hill in Long Beach, and this is looking out towards, this is actually the San Gabriel Mountains, Mount Baldy. All that's houses in the distance. But there's a fold in the crust from all the tectonic activity where there is bulges of oil coming up. And this is a map of the historic and ongoing oil drilling in LA. There's a lot of ongoing oil drilling still happening. The pump jacks, the oil derricks, you can just see them when you're in places like Long Beach. Remember this line right there? The migration, the biggest migration of African Americans from the South to Los Angeles was between 1940 and 1970, and this was to help for the war effort. There's a lot of jobs for that, but also in terms of other places to work, this was a big thing. These areas were redlined, and it became a cycle in terms of where people were certainly living. The white population, I actually have a joke about this one. So there was a lot of movement out of the center. If you're curious what a white neighborhood in LA looks like, I hope this is funny. Well, Courtney's house is up here, Kylie's is down there, and Kim's is over here. And you got to imagine that it looks like what you think. It looks like Larry David's neighborhood in a lot of places in LA where it's primarily white, very expensive. Asian in the San Gabriel Valley, in the Puente Hills, and then also this, primarily Korean, Vietnamese, Taiwanese, and ethnic Chinese. And so I live in the San Gabriel Valley, just looks like this, kind of pretty standard. And then Hispanic or Latino, South LA, and East LA. Another thing I was talking about was oil. There was another problem with development in LA, and that's why they channelized the rivers, and those were the flood maps. And so another place where there was lots of redlining was along the courses of the major rivers where there used to be flooding. When we're thinking about who was living in these locations, primarily Hispanic and Latino, back in the day, the population exploded in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And whoops, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction with my pointer. And so confined in a location in LA that was already redlined, and so already didn't have the infrastructure in place, for some of the things I was talking about earlier. So what I wanted to get at is also freeway development as a thing in LA in terms of where the redlining was occurring. And this is a map of just a static pollution map of Los Angeles. This is South LA, East LA. So of course, who's living in some of these locations? You're getting bad air. You're not seeing all these birds. You're not getting the benefits of nature. You're very far from nature. These are some of the most park poor places in the entire country. To actually get to a park, you got to get in your car and drive 20, 30 minutes just to get to a city park. And so it's pretty bad in terms of some of the amenities that you get in certain parts of LA. Okay, so I just want to walk through this. When we look at the different HLLC codes, this is just overlapping what I was just showing you with some census data on top of these different types of grades here. Black or African American, you don't quite see a pattern there. We thought it would be much higher in the red line zones. For the white population, still in the A and the B zones. For the Asian population, kind of similar to the African American population, don't quite see that pattern. But for the Hispanic and Latino, totally the reverse in terms of what we were seeing from that white population. So again, my institution is 75% Hispanic or Latino. So this is a very important question for the students in my institution because they're all from East LA or South LA. And so this is something that's really close for them. And so when we're asking this question, can you get this different experience of birds in your neighborhood, wherever you're living? When we look at the Black or African American population with these forest bird abundance, you don't really see anything. With the white population, you see this positive correlation. Note the color of the dots, if you can see that. Sorry for the red green color blindness, if that's a thing. And then for the Asian population, There's not really much there. And then you see the opposite to what we were noticing with the white one. Again, this is most of my students at my university here. And when we go to this, they get so frustrated about this because they say, I just thought that was my neighborhood. I just thought that's where I was growing up. I never went up to Beverly Hills. I didn't know there was this investment thing that was, limiting how big the lot sizes were or whatever it could be. And so it's a frustrating reality when we're looking at this. Again, a very obvious one, but when you start putting the numbers on paper, it's something that I don't really know what to do. Are there solutions with this one? Okay, so I want to focus on these two dots up here. This is just looking at a correlation with our forest birds and our percent tree cover. And I want to focus on Venice and Pasadena. They're doing pretty well. They were redlined. They're up there at the top. You might think, okay, there's some interventions that we can actually do with this to make this work. This is what Venice used to look like if you want to go take a dip in the beach. There, doesn't look inviting. And so it was redlined again because of a lot of the oil pressures that were going on in that area. And of course, now Venice is one of the most expensive Santa Monica was like this too. And of course, Venice and Santa Monica are some of the most expensive real estate in the entire country right now. This is market dynamics. This isn't some intervention at the city where they figured it out and like how to kind of climb out of this problem. So there's other stuff happening here. The other city I mentioned is Pasadena, where I've been living. I don't live there right now, but it's where I started when I was in LA. This place is obsessed with trees. It was people from the upper Midwest and the East Coast that moved there and planted it effectively like an arboretum all over the city. And so a lot of that was historic before a lot of the places were redlined. Jackie Robinson's neighborhood, redline, all that kind of stuff in Pasadena. So again, it wasn't some type of intervention that they figured it out and what to do in terms of how to climb out of this. So it's a real problem with what to do because we're almost 100 years later and you could just see this all over Los Angeles when you're driving around and in many other cities too. Okay, so one more thing I want to get to. I just want to do a time check. Okay, I got about 8 minutes, I think, so we're good here on time. I want to start getting into this idea about our future cities. We have to bring up good old Charlie Brown again with this because what I've talked about is a bummer right now. I've talked about the devastation of an avian community when you build a city. And then I just talked about these horrible practices that were going on, not just in LA, but all over the country that have really affected not just birds, but then people throughout this area. And so you definitely have to feel Charlie Brownish when you're thinking about this stuff. But I want to talk about some positive things because I want to leave us on the note of inspiration when we're thinking about our cities. And the first thing I want to do is look at a beautiful grass lawn like we see in LA. And I'm going to get to the punchline with this one. When you drive around LA, which I was trying to like notice when I was driving around, it's pretty common, right? To see this idea about having grass. 70% of LA is residential. It's just suburbs forever when you're driving out towards Riverside or the San Fernando Valley and even all the way down into San Diego, it just keeps going. And it looks like this. And I say about 99% of residential areas look like this. That's my made up number because that's just what it feels like when you're driving around. So what a lot of people are doing is this all over the city. And so this idea about planting native plants, shrubs, grasses, remember the birds that weren't doing so well in some of these locations. This is an intervention that's actually from the top. This is the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power that's paying people to do this, and it's for a water savings thing. I've been having numerous conversations with people about this, and this feels like 20 years ago, people were doing this in Madison, Wisconsin, when I lived up there, doing this kind of stuff. And so LA feels very far behind to me when we're thinking about this, but at least it got the memo right now. At least it got the memo before. LA is all about what it's going to look like on TV. In 4 years, they want to get that money shot from NBC in terms of what it's going to look like during the Olympics. And so they're going to pour money into doing things like this all over the city, which is kind of exciting. I wish they would do it for other reasons, but it's kind of exciting that something like that's going to happen. Hey, Utah State University, I've been noticing that this is catching on too. Maybe us in the arid West, maybe that message hasn't quite made it as fast as other parts of the country, but we're all thinking about this stuff. So I just want to talk about this a little bit because we've been doing a lot of research on this in LA as well. And so that's the idea about assessing the significance of native landscape residential yards as habitat for our wildlife. And I'm going to talk about birds and insect pollinators here. And I'm just going to give you 2 slides. This slide's kind of hard to read. We have this paired sampling design all over LA where we go to these native landscape yards. I mean, come on, obvious. It's going to be different. What you're going to see here. Not every yard looks like that down there in the bottom. But it's this paired design. We go out, we survey birds, we survey insect pollinators, We stare at plants and wait for that butterfly to go and visit. So there's actually some kind of type of ecology happening, some interaction that's happening there. We do foraging observations from birds and try to piece apart whether they love certain native plants, love non-native plants, what it is. And I'm not going to turn this into a thing about native plants good, non-native plants bad, because we don't subscribe to that. We know we have to have exotic plants in the city. We know that's going to be a thing for preferences. LA has about 3 species of trees that they can grow in the valleys that will actually live in the city. So you can't have an urban forest unless we're thinking about exotic plants. But I'm still going to talk about why natives are cool for this. Think of Doug Tallamy's work when we're doing all this and all the coevolution between insects and plants and birds that are going to feed on them. So we're thinking about food web dynamics here. So this is from a paper from 2023. When you want to just look at on your y-axis the percent of bird feeding observations just strictly on native or non-native plants in these yards, you see an increase on those native plants, and that's going to be for quercus, oak species, heteromyles, which is called toyon, salvia, sage, arctostavlos, eriogonum, Artemisia is even in there. Trying to think of some species that would be around here as well. And then there's like nothing but a grass over there, just the seed heads that some birds would pick off for the non-native plants. When you look at this slightly differently, when we're just looking at plant cover and then percent of bird feeding observations, you just see that positive slope going up again where the native plants are. When you look at that picture that I just showed you, the grass and of the shrubs, it's like, duh, of course, that's what you're going to find when you do this stuff. It's a little more complicated than that, though, because of course we know we're going to find these things, but we are trying to do something where we are giving people information about what you can actually do to promote these types of food web dynamics, whether it's birds or insects in your yard. Here's what you should plant. Here's how we should work on this. There's a lot more I can say about that we're working on right now, but I just don't quite have the time. But unsurprisingly, these birds love to forage and prey items in these native plants. And so our next question was, about native landscape yards having a diverse pollinator assemblage. And I'm just going to show you one graph that just seals the deal with this stuff. And this is just from a student who just finished Esmeralda. She's now a PhD student at Davis. And what did she do? She did this awesome study for what birders would do when you're looking at insects. And so just an observational study. We were going to do some more invasive stuff with capturing insects. People didn't want us to do that in their yards. And so we were like, we'll just sit there and watch the plants like we would with bird foraging. Here is the network, plant or flower visitation network for birds and insects and plants in these native landscape yards. And it's a mess, right? What is it going to look like in the conventional yard with the grass and the ornamental shrubs? It's going to look quite a bit different, right? Look at how weak that is when we're doing this. And so we're talking about 8 times the number of interactions that we were noticing just from observation, looking at these flower visitation networks and these native landscape yards versus the conventional yards. I would piece this together about, is it really the native plants that you're getting at, or is it just simply the difference in plant cover? I have some other stuff about that. And just the punchline, it kind of is the native plants a little bit. It really does seem to increase that flower vegetation network. So pretty cool when you're thinking about this. I feel that across, let me make sure, time check. I feel pretty strongly that if you want to do something, and if we all want to do something at scale, at a place like LA, which is just suburban development everywhere, if you want to really increase biodiversity in the city, I love mountain lions, I love bobcats, I love all that stuff, but this is where it's at in terms of if you really want to increase nature in the city, you just sit here and do this stuff. We converted our yard from grass to native plants, and I can't remember who I was telling this, but within 2 weeks of doing this, the first cool sighting we had some milkweed that we planted, the monarch came down. And I have no idea where that monarch came from or how it found it, but it just was really kind of quick when that started happening. Okay, so let's move on. And I just want to round this talk out with thinking about reasons to be hopeful about the state of urban ecology in our cities. One is it's this perfect blend of biodiversity and people. Everybody can wrap their minds around this. Everybody can wrap their minds around what a tree might do for some type of bird. Everybody can think about this type of stuff. This is an event. This is just at a community garden where we planted certain native plants to try to bring in different pollinators into the community gardens. It's a fun thing. There's placards out there. People get psyched about this stuff. If we're really going to do something like this, meaning if we're going to really reimagine our cities, it's got to be from the community. It's got to be from the bottom up. Yes, the top-down stuff about the rebates, the money to rip out the turf, that's really important. But every community is going to have a different idea about what they want. Every community is going to have a different idea about how they want to develop things, and that's important in terms of trying to plug into that. And so this idea about unioning what people think in their communities and then the science that we're all focused on is going to be really important with this. Student engagement is huge. Whenever we run a cure, which is focused on, we have one about our redlining and all that stuff, the students are just immediately engaged in learning about this stuff. Then you teach whatever ecology you want to teach. You can teach all the traditional stuff, but just doing it in terms of thinking about our urban ecosystems. And we found that to be really useful. We got to the desert, we go to Catalina Island, we take students all over the place in Southern California, and those trips are fun, but I got to tell you, the engagement's higher and the interest is higher when we're like at some local park and then thinking about the historical ecology of the area, what it used to be. All right, so city engagement is important. This is one of the first projects we did this work on, looking at street trees and how important they were for birds and coming up with this profile about which trees were important for birds. The city of LA is making their first urban forest management plan right now, and we are totally collaborating, getting all of our stuff just right into these plans. A lot of our papers we publish, and some of you guys may be way better than I am at this, we publish them and then you're just like, I hope somebody looks at this. I hope somebody does something with this. At least for this, I know, because these are all my friends. And I say, look at this cool stuff we did here. Here's this. And so there's a lot of city engagement with this, which is pretty cool. And if you could do that in a place like LA, which you're affecting a big thing, which is pretty great. Okay, so restoration efforts can lead to success. This is an endangered least Bell's vireo, a very awesome bird at Rio State Park. This whole, like, if you build it, it will come kind of thing. So I mentioned our rivers are a mess in Los Angeles. They're channelized. There's big time problems there. They kind of look like this. There's lots of cool stuff that goes on, whether there are projects or whatever. I love hanging out in the LA River. We're part of this big project down there for restoration. But what people are starting to do is thinking about things like planting native plants at different parks. And these Bell's vireos are just at this park right here, which it doesn't look like much, but it's enough habitat where a bird's going to migrate to breed here. I mentioned the hooded oriole and that bird in terms of that orange bird about the future for LA. Very few birds migrate to LA to breed. Why would you? Why would you be like, hey, there's that smoggy place with concrete everywhere. I'm going to go breed there. No way. During the winter, stuff comes there, but then they bail. They go up to the mountains and do stuff. These are some of the first like cool birds that we've been surveying that are actually coming to the city to migrate because of very simple things like just some basic restoration stuff. When you're that far down there, in terms of what the habitat you're providing, even a little bit can make a big difference, which is pretty cool. And are they doing well? That measure of habitat quality, they've fledged. And so they did what they were supposed to do, which is pretty cool. Okay, so cities, just a summary. Of course, they radically alter our biodiversity, obvious. That's not the point of this. The point of this is thinking exactly how and then diving into the nuance about all this stuff and then in terms of what you can actually do about it. These historical investment practices continue to negatively affect people. And I just want to say that if I didn't know about this 5 years ago, now I feel like everybody knows about this because people are talking about it a lot. Stories on NPR, there's all this stuff all over the place. That's a good thing. And so that's one of the ways where I think more awareness is going to help us with this problem. And there's many opportunities for forward-facing development of our cities to benefit people in biodiversity. I hope I've showed you some of those today. There's lots of great resources out here. I mentioned Chris. I know he was here, Chris Schell. We have this cool book out. There's a lot of people thinking about this stuff. We all should be able, this is like from Melbourne, but we all should be able to have situations like this, not just the wealthiest, not just the cities where they're already embedded and forced it. We should be able to think about this stuff in terms of how we can redesign our cities, again, to benefit both people and biodiversity. All right, thank you. I will take any questions if you have them. You guys all know about Ridgemont High, right? With Jess McCauley? I hope so. For you young ones, you got to watch that movie. Yeah, right.
Earlier, you're looking at the effects by the cross for species of change in the lake. Did you also look at